Welcome to the Prison Professors Podcast. We serve people who face challenges with prosecution, sentencing, and prison. My co-founders are Sean Hopwood and Justin Paperny. My name is Michael Santos. We create digital content and our team offers individual consulting services. We also assist agencies that want to improve outcomes. To learn how we can help you, text the word PrisonPro to 44222. Again, text PrisonPro to 44222 and get our free brochure. You can also visit us at prisonprofessors.com or contact Justin at 818-424-2220. Please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. Send confirmation that you reviewed our podcast and we'll send you a free digital book. Stay tuned for a 20 to 30-minute episode of Prison Professors. Today, I would like to share some of the books that empowered me through the 26 years that I served in prison, because I receive a lot of questions about what books should I be reading if I'm in struggle. And there are so many books out there that truly inspired me and empowered me. But today, I'd like to talk about 10 of those books. I'd like to explain why I read them, how they influenced me at different stages of the journey. And I would like to suggest for you a strategy with regard to reading for a purpose, with regard to reading in such a way that the books will have a direct impact in helping you break through the struggle that you're going through right now, whether it's imprisonment or whether it is some type of a challenge you're facing out here in society. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the 10 different books. They're not the 10 books, but they are 10 books that come to my mind just off of the top of my head. I'd like to tell you why I read them. I would like to tell you what I learned from them. And more importantly, I'd like to tell you how reading those books influenced my adjustment through the journey and would influence my return to society after 26 years of imprisonment with my dignity intact and with opportunities for success. Because I really believe that's the pattern. It's pursuing a deliberate path. It's understanding that every step I take when I'm going through a challenge is going to have some direct relationship to the person that I want to become when I break through this period of struggle. So I'll take you back to the very beginning of my journey, and I will talk about what first resulted in my transformation. When I was inside of a jail cell, I had just been convicted of operating a continuing criminal enterprise that exposed me to a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. I didn't know what sentence my judge would impose, but I certainly knew that there would not be a sentence of less than 10 years. And in fact, 10 years seemed unlikely because I did go to trial. I did perjure myself on the witness stand. I did fail to express remorse or accept any responsibility for the bad decisions I had made when I was 20 and 21 years old. So I knew I was going to prison for a long time. And when I left that courtroom in Tacoma after my judge had imposed sentence, I went back to my jail cell and, you started to pray. I started to ask God for guidance. And that led me to the first book that I want to talk about, which is the Bible. Now, I was not a particularly religious person before I went to prison, nor was I a religious person during the time that I served my sentence. But reading the Bible, I found, brought me closer to God in such a way that I felt some type of guidance helping me through the journey, because I was praying not to get out of jail. I was just praying for strength that would empower me through what promised to be a very difficult time, or what I expected to be a difficult time. After all, I was only 23 years old and I was being separated from the people I loved and the people who loved me. I was humiliated because I had just been convicted of a crime, a very serious crime. I had already been locked in jail in what's called pretrial detention for nearly a year. And I was just looking for something to help me get through those very despondent times. And I picked up the Bible and I started reading the book of Genesis, and that led me on a path of reading the Bible every day, not an extensive amount. I would just read a few of the chapters, or I think they're called verses or passages, reading all from Genesis and all the way through the book of Revelation. And when I finished that, I would just go back to Genesis and read the message again. And through this book, I was able to feel as though the challenges and the struggles that I'm going through are not new. There have been people going through challenges and struggles all through history. And in many of those books in the Bible, I found strength. I found some message that life is short. And although I'm going to be in prison for 9,500 days for 26 years, I didn't even really know how long I'd be in prison at that time. But as I was reading through it, I just said, God, people have been challenged from the beginning of recorded history. And people who had a deliberate path or had faith or had some type of a strength within, they would always be able to build a better outcome. And I found that message in the Bible, and so I read it every day, just a little bit, because I just felt it would keep me on course, it would keep me on line. And so that's one of the books that helped me through the journey. The second book, and I would say this book had the pivotal moment. It was the transformational moment in my life. And I was still in the Pierce County jail when I read it. I've spoken about it numerous times. It was the story of the Crito, the story of Socrates while he was in jail. I first read that story in an anthology called A Treasury of Philosophy, and that later led me to reading The Republic by Plato. And Plato, of course, was a student of Socrates and wrote extensively about Socrates. And by reading that philosophy, I developed a great sense of hope and meaning in my life, and a belief that there was a fundamental difference between perception and reality. The reality was that I was in prison, but I could choose to look at how I was going to go through this prison sentence. And I needed that strength. I needed it to carry me through, because I always needed to see myself as how I was going to emerge from prison. And I needed to see myself as being somebody who could create meaning out of this lengthy journey. And I found that in one of the books in the Republic. It's called The Allegory of the Cave. And for those of you who don't know the Allegory of the Cave, I'm going to try and give you a very quick synopsis of what I learned from that book. There were several people, and Plato asked the readers. Actually, I think he spoke about it as if it were Socrates telling the story, but there were several people who were supposedly living in a cave, and they'd never emerged from that cave their entire life, and they were fastened in such a way that all they could see what was directly in front of them, and behind them there was a light, and that light would reflect puppets or shadows on the wall, or anything that was moving between the individuals who were the prisoners of the cave and the light. People would walk by it, and that would reflect a shadow on the wall. And what Plato's message was that people who looked at that wall, that was all that they could ever see. They could only see those shadows on the wall. And because that's all they saw, they believed it was real. And that carried them through their entire lives until one of these prisoners escaped, and he happened to finally see that everything he had been looking at had been nothing more than an illusion. Those shadows on the wall, they were not real. They were just perceptions. And so he was able to recognize that the world is much bigger than we can see with just our eyes. And when I read that story, I had a sense of hope that perhaps I could have some role in opening the eyes of my fellow citizens and helping them see that the bad decisions an individual made at one time of his life isn't necessarily reality of what is the inside of the heart, the soul, the character of that individual. And it empowered me to start looking at the life differently. So Plato's Republic had a huge influence on my life. Actually, all of the writings of Plato, who really chronicled Socrates' life, and then later many of the other Greek philosophers had an influence on my life. The third book that I want to talk about, I remembered reading while I was inside of the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. So I had been transferred from the Pierce County Jail, and I was living inside of the penitentiary and, thinking about how am I going to get through this journey. And I remember reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. It was actually written, I think, or co-written with Alex Haley, who is very famous for having written many books, including the story Roots. But I identified with this book of Malcolm X because he had this transformation while he was inside of a jail cell. And although he is certainly a controversial figure in American history, he he had this quest to learn and this quest for self-improvement, and he was developing his vocabulary and developing his communication skills, and eventually he became a really great orator that influenced and persuaded many people, and I aspired to become a great communicator. So while I was in that jail cell, I remember reading that book and reading of how he was developing his vocabulary from inside of a jail cell, and I was doing the same thing. I was working to develop my vocabulary, develop my communication skills, because when I walked into prison, I didn't have a very good education and I didn't have a good command of the English language, but I aspired. I wanted to be able to communicate because I recognized the power of communication. And so that book by Malcolm X really helped me. It gave me a vision that says, I am going to come out of here stronger. Although I still had more than 20 years to serve when I read that book, it did give me a sense of strength and belief in myself and restored some confidence. So I would recommend that book to somebody who's facing struggle. Viktor Frankl, this book number 4, his book is Man's Search for Meaning. And I derived an enormous sense of confidence when I read Viktor Frankl's book, because it is a short book, as I recall, about 200 pages, small pages, but he tells the story of his unjust imprisonment and the enormous suffering that he endured. He was a physician in Germany, and he just, I think, graduated from medical school, and I think he was a psychiatrist also. And while he was, just starting his life, the war had begun, World War II, and the Nazis rounded him up and his family up, and he was taken inside of a concentration camp. I believe it was at Buchenwald, possibly Auschwitz. But while he was there, he watched his loved ones executed, and he never knew from one day to the next whether he would be executed. But despite that despair in which he lived, he found a great sense of strength in helping other people and in just deriving a sense of meaning in his life by choosing how he was going to respond to struggle and difficulty. And I read that book several times during my prison term because I always had to keep my mind focused that I could choose how I was going to respond to the prison sentence that I had received, or I could choose to allow it to cripple my spirit and extinguish my hope. So in Viktor Frankl's story, because he was incarcerated despite not doing anything wrong other than being Jewish, and he was incarcerated never knowing from one day to the next whether he would live or die, yet in those circumstances he always had a sense of meaning and hope, and I found a great sense of strength in reading that book. Number 5 on my list is Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. I read that book. I don't remember where I was. I think I was in Fort Dix, New Jersey, so I'd already been incarcerated for a considerable length of time when I read that book. Probably 15 or 16 years. But I knew that I had longer than 10 years to go when I read that book. And when you have 15 years of prison behind you and 10 or 11 years of prison ahead of you, you're saying, God, it's a long walk to freedom. But what I found in Nelson Mandela's book was an enormous amount of respect and admiration for him, because he had served roughly the length of time that I was expecting to serve, and yet he had no anger, no animosity, no bitterness, nothing but love for his fellow human beings. And I admired that. I wanted to emerge from prison without any bitterness. I wanted to emerge with my dignity intact. And I wanted to feel as though I could live the rest of my life as a good citizen. And listening to Nelson Mandela or reading Nelson Mandela's story, I say listening because sometimes when I was reading, I felt as if these people were speaking to me and inspiring me, and I was listening to them in my head, and I would think about them as I was running long distances around the track and think about how I am going to emerge from this journey and strive to emulate their good character, strive to become a good citizen. So, number 5 on my list is Nelson Mandela's A Long Walk to Freedom. A 6th book is by Gandhi, and it was his autobiography. I remember reading about this incredible man who believed in peace and believed in transforming the world through personal empowerment and personal demonstrating the strength of the individual rather than through violence. And his book just had a profound influence on me. In fact, I always remember the quotes that he had given, particularly, "Be the change that you want to see in the world." He was a man that really transformed injustice in the entire country of India that was being subjugated by totalitarian rule or injustice there, and rather than fighting, he just chose to try and transform the world through peace. And I just had a great deal of admiration for him, because his entire life was one of struggle, but at the same time it was also one of contribution and striving to become something better. And people like Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, they were both lawyers, as I recall, before, and despite them being well-educated individuals, they endured a great deal of challenge. Viktor Frankl, the same thing. They faced their struggle despite being well-educated people, and yet they always kept their dignity intact. They never felt humiliated or belittled because of the injustices that were heaped upon them, but they always just strove to do better. Well, I didn't go to prison as an educated man, but I aspired to emerge as an educated man. And I looked to people like Viktor Frankl, Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, their stories, and believed that if I come out of here more educated, if I come out of here more capable of communicating, I could have a small role in influencing the way our system and our society responds to the criminal justice system I wanted to improve. But I also really felt passionately that my journey in prison was really, it's the context of the story, but the reality is this is a human story. We all face struggle and adversity, and I've met so many people who seem to be in a much bigger prison just because of the way they look at the world. And I wanted to change those perceptions for people who are living in challenge and let them know, hey, there is a way through this. And that's what I strive to teach through the courses on michaelsantos.com, is that, there's a pattern to break through. And I learned from great leaders. Steve Jobs, great leader. I love one of his quotes was, and I know he took it from Picasso, but he said that good artists copy ideas and great artists steal ideas. And I just stole ideas from people like Gandhi and Mandela and Frankl, Malcolm X and Socrates and Plato and the characters in the Bible. And from those people, I really believed that I could learn and empower myself and eventually pass what I have learned on to others. So if you're facing struggle, some of these books I think may help you to an extent of saying, I can get through this. I can make it to the next hurdle. The seventh book is called A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It was written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who's really probably most famous for his big book called the Gulag Archipelago, which is his story about Siberia and the Russian prison camps. I was inspired by Solzhenitsyn because I understood that through his writing, he was able to influence the entire world, the way the world looked at the Soviet Union, and the world had been so cut off because the Soviet Union was behind what was called the Iron Curtain at the time, and his writings brought an international awareness to the prison system, and he inspired me to do a lot of my own writing. In fact, by reading that book is what led eventually to my book Inside: Life Behind Bars in America. When I initially wrote that proposal, I wrote to my agent and it indicated I wanted to write a really much bigger book, a 250,000 word book. Manuscript is what I proposed. And I wanted to just describe the entire American criminal justice system because I really believed that it was the greatest social injustice of our time that just perpetuated intergenerational cycles of failure. And I wanted to have a role in reaching out and influencing the way Americans looked at that system. It was a pretty ambitious goal for somebody who was incarcerated. I think I was in like my 15th or 16th year, and I just felt that a big monumental project like that would keep me focused, would keep me driven, would keep me moving toward a future. And I eventually got a publishing deal with St. Martin's Press, but it was not for a 250,000 word manuscript. They wanted a more condensed version, and so I wrote a manuscript of about 110,000 words, which became Inside Life Behind Bars in America, a very graphic look at American prisons from different security levels. Book Ivan Denisovich, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, is a fictional book. It is a story about a man who is enduring 10 years in prison in Siberia, and he is talking about his entire day, from the moment his eyes open until the moment his eyes close. And he's just talking about what's going through his mind, what are his decisions, and how he is. He was different from me in the sense that he was very angry and bitter and felt wrongfully incarcerated. Whereas in my case, I made bad decisions, and I was in prison because of the stupid, foolish decisions I made when I was 20 and 21 years old. But I still found some inspiration. In fact, it inspired me to write one of my other books called Prison, My 8,344th Day, which describes how I would go through a typical day during my 23rd year of imprisonment. And I wrote that book as a companion to my other book, Earning Freedom, Conquering a 45-Year Sentence. I wanted to provide readers with a micro view, how do you get through a single day, and a macro view, how does one sustain a high level of energy and discipline while traversing a 26-year odyssey through prison. So Ivan Denisovich was one of my inspirations. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was an inspiration to me, and so I would consider that book as one of the more pivotal or influential books during my journey. Number 8, I will have to go with Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I read that book probably when I was still in the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, so relatively early in my journey, probably my 5th or 6th year, 4th year, something like that. But I remember seeing a great deal of wisdom in that book. I mean, there was nothing earth-shattering or new. I don't think that any of us who strive to inspire people are revealing anything that's new. In fact, all of these messages are consistent through all of the literature that I have read, and that is that there is a pattern for breaking through struggle and challenge and making it to a better, more successful outcome, a better life. It's all about deliberateness. And I don't think that I could remember all the 7 habits right now off the top of my head, but I'm going to try. It was something along the lines of, first things first. You've got to understand that there are certain steps that you have to take initially in order to advance. The second, as I recall, was be proactive. Don't wait for the world to change. Don't wait for opportunities to come. Make them happen. The third, as I recall, or one of the initial ones, was to begin with the end in mind, to understand where you are, where you want to go, and reverse engineer your path. And another one was to think win-win, to try and create programs and opportunities that not only advance your life, but advance the life of everybody around you. And that can result in a cycle of success, and you can will it into your life. That was 4. Let's see, there's 5 or there's 3 others. I don't want to spend too much time. One was sharpen the saw. I remember one was, I don't recall, but it's an incredibly influential book. It's been 20 years or better since I read that book, and it still means something to me. So I hope that may be a resource that you, if you're facing a challenge, would consider. A 9th book is Good to Great by Jim Collins, which I read much later in my journey. And that book is a business book. It talks about building great businesses. And I really learned a lot from CEOs and business leaders reading business books, because I found a great similarity of what is necessary to transform one's life is the same principled approach that is necessary to transform a business and to build something great. Jim Collins spoke about great businesses pursuing always these big, hairy, audacious goals, which he spoke about, a BHAG. He spoke about really going deep and becoming incredibly focused on a specific area that you can do exceptionally well. And that's really what I wanted to achieve while I was incarcerated. I wanted to develop communication skills to the best of my ability. You don't emerge as a great communicator through prison, but I just wanted to try, because I believed that the pen was mightier than the sword. And if I could develop stronger communication skills and develop bigger platforms to reach a wider audience, I would have a much more fulfilling life as a contributing citizen, as an individual who's living a life of relevance and meaning and contribution, while at the same time building something that is sustainable. That was always a vision for me, to build something sustainable. And the 10th book that I will talk about is What Got You Here Won't Get You There by Marshall Goldsmith, another business book. Marshall Goldsmith is a professor and an executive coach for CEOs, and I think he worked at I think he was a professor at USC, among other schools. Perhaps it was UCLA. So I knew it was somewhere in Southern California. But he was talking about what does it take to become a CEO of an organization. And he was saying that the skill set that is necessary to advance from one area of a corporate environment is fundamentally different from what you would need to know to become a CEO. To become a VP of sales or a head of sales might require a personality and a drive and a competitive effort that is different from a CEO that has to manage teams and inspire teams and balance and keep the entire organization moving. And that's not something that I am as skillful at as far as managing teams, because I've always been an individual. And so I've had to go through prison by myself, and I had to be focusing on how can I improve myself in spite of the environment in which I live. So I understood that the message that I got from Goldsmith was the challenges and the discipline that got me through 25, 26 years in prison were very helpful. But I would need to develop new skills to become successful in society. And that book resulted in me making a conscientious effort to find new mentors and to develop new skills in business and finance and persuasion that was different. In the beginning portion of my journey, I really focused on education. I focused on finding mentors from academia and publishing. Later, toward the end of my journey, I began focusing more on building relationships with business leaders who would help me transition into society so that I could overcome the challenges that come with serving 26 years in prison. And it had a huge impact on me. When I got out of prison, I was able to persuade a real estate developer to finance me on my first home. And I bought my first home within a couple of weeks of walking out of prison. In fact, I was still in prison because I was in the halfway house, but I negotiated a real estate transaction for a $400,000 home, despite having a 000 credit score. That home has now earned me more than $150,000 in equity. I still own it. I've got tenants in the house that are paying my mortgage on a 15-year note. I've recently just entered into a real estate contract for my second home, a $785,000 purchase. None of that would have happened had I not been looking at, say, I've got to develop new resources. I've got to develop new mentors. I've got to build credit. I've got to develop an income. All of that was incredibly important to me. That's what I strive to teach in our programs at michaelsantos.com, that individuals who have a deliberate purpose, that know where they're going, they can reverse engineer a way that will take them there. And that's what made all the difference in my life. So those are 10 books to get started. If you're interested in trying to develop a sense of worth and meaning and relevance, and if you want to empower yourself while you're going through struggle, those 10 books may be someplace to start. But I read hundreds and hundreds of books during my journey. And one of the strategies that I used was, after I read each book, I would write a book report. And that book report was deliberate. It was to focus on reading books that would have a direct relationship on what I would become. And let me tell you the format of those book reports, because you may want to choose to do the same. The book reports I read all began with, number one, I'd write the title of the book. I would write the author of the book. I would write when I read the book. I would write which book it was in my accountability log of how many I was going to read that given year. And then I would answer 3 questions in my book report. The first, why did I read this book? What was it that made this book stand out to me? Who recommended it? Where did I hear about it? What prompted me to pick that book up and invest 20 hours or 15 hours or 30 hours to read that book. So that was important. Second was I answered this question. What did I learn from this book? And if I didn't learn anything from this book, I would write that. But generally, the books that I read were deliberate. They had a purpose. There was a reason I was reading that book, and I always got a great message. There was always wisdom. In fact, the authors became my teachers. They became my mentors. They became my friends, and that's what I chose to demonstrate. I'm reading for a purpose. It's going to have a relationship, and that leads to the third question, which is, how will having read this book contribute to my success upon release? So it was very clear. I'm not reading books for fun. I am reading books to empower me, to make sure that I return to society strong, with my dignity intact, with new opportunities, able to overcome what other people think may not be possible for somebody who served longer than a quarter century in prison. That was a strategy that empowered me. I hope that it will empower you. That is my message today on the Earning Freedom Podcast. For more insight on how to become a mastermind of this strategy of overcoming struggle, I encourage you to opt in at michaelsantos.com. Subscribe to my newsletter. Join the mastermind group, because you too will learn how you can become something more in your career, in your relationship, in your ability to create wealth. If I can do it while going through 26 years in prison, just think what you can do. On behalf of my two partners, Sean Hopwood and Justin Paperny, I want to thank you for listening to the Prison Professors program. We strive to inspire and educate people who are either going into the criminal justice system, people who are in prison, people who have returned from prison. We strive to show that they can make plans, that they can build a life of success and relevance and contribution regardless of what challenges they have faced in the past. If you'd like to know more about how we help, please visit prisonprofessors.com or text the word Prison Pro to 44222. We will be back tomorrow with an inspiring guest. Thank you.